Okay, so today we're diving into U.S.-China relations. And I gotta say, this is not exactly light reading. You know, it's always in the headlines. But those like little snippets, we never really get the full picture.
Yeah, you're right. It's almost like trying to understand a movie, but you've only watched the trailer. You had a few of the exciting parts,
Yeah,
maybe a cool line here and there,
yeah,
but you're missing the real story.
exactly. And that's what we do here, right, on this deep dive. And today we're using Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides Trap?
Oh, Allison. Now, there's someone who knows how to make you think. He's really good at taking these complex historical patterns, and then he shows us how they apply to today.
Right. And in this book, the big question he's wrestling with is, can the U.S. and China actually avoid a serious conflict? And to answer that, he uses this idea of Thucydides trap. So basically what it means is when you've got a rising power, like China challenging the power that's already there, like the
Yeah.
U.S., well, things can get kind of messy.
It's definitely more than just messy. See, Thucydides was this Athenian general and a historian. And way back in the 5th century BC, he wrote about this whole dynamic based on what he saw firsthand during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that war totally reshaped ancient Greece. So yeah, not messing around.
Exactly. And here's what's so interesting and kind of scary. Allison found that this pattern, where a rising power and an established power clash, it's happened again and again throughout history. Actually, in the last 500 years, 12 out of 16 similar situations have ended in war.
12 out of 16. Okay, that's a little unsettling. No pressure. U.S. and China, right. But seriously, the whole world is watching.
It is a pivotal moment for sure. But just so we're clear, this doesn't mean that war is inevitable. It's more about understanding the possible dangers so that we can, hopefully avoid them.
Which leads us to that central question, can the U.S. and China beat the odds? Like, what do you think? Are we going down a bad path here?
To answer that,
Yeah.
we need to look at what's driving China's rise and why it's making some people nervous.
Okay, so China's rise, it's been pretty unbelievable when you really think about it. I mean, just a few decades ago, they weren't even close to the U.S. economically. Now, they're like this huge global force.
It's really amazing when you think about it. The speed and the scale of their economic transformation, it's kind of mind-blowing. They've gone from being almost irrelevant to the world's second largest economy in what, 30 years?
It's like they read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and said,
Yeah.
all right, it's go time.
Yeah. Allison talks about that in his book, Destined for War. He has this interesting story about a British representative who went to China back in the 18th century to try and set up trade.
Mm.
And at that time, Chinese workers were way less productive than British workers.
Yeah, that story. It really makes you realize how much things have changed.
I know, right? It's crazy how different it is today. Now the situation is almost the opposite. So China's per capita productivity is still lower than the U.S., but it's catching up fast. And this is where things get interesting.
This is where we start to get a little worried.
Right. Well, yeah, Allison points out that if China's per capita productivity hits just 50% of the U.S. level, which is totally possible in the next few decades, their economy will be double the size of the U.S. economy.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, it's a big deal.
It is. I mean, think about what that means.
Mm.
China would have so much more power on the world stage.
Yeah.
They could call the shots in trade deals, put tons of money into developing countries, basically just reshape the whole global power dynamic.
So everyone should probably go learn Mandarin right now. Maybe buy stock in chopsticks. Just kidding. Maybe.
But seriously, it's a huge shift, and it's something that leaders everywhere are paying attention to very, very closely.
You mentioned per capita productivity, and that makes me think about the whole GDP versus purchasing power parity thing, or PPP as the cool kids call it.
Yeah.
How does that all play into measuring economic power?
That's a great question. There's always this debate about the best way to measure a country's economic strength, like nominal GDP. That's what we usually hear about. And it just looks at the total value of everything produced in a country. But PPP is different. It considers the cost of living and inflation.
So it's like how far your money actually goes in a country.
Yes, exactly. And Allison quotes this guy, Stanley Fisher. He used to be the vice chair of the Federal Reserve. And Fisher says that PPP is actually the most useful way to measure potential military power, too.
Really? So a country's ability to produce stuff domestically instead of just their overall wealth might actually be a better way to gauge their economic power.
That's the argument. It makes sense when you think about it. Like, a country might have a high GDP, but what if they import most of their military equipment? I mean, their ability to handle a long conflict would be limited.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about how big the economy is, but what it can actually produce. And speaking of power, It's not all about economics, is it? China's military ambitions are a big part of this, too.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where things can get a little tense. So China has historically spent less of its GDP on defense compared to the U.S., but that's changing,
Yeah.
and quickly.
Yeah, they've been seriously beefing up their military.
Totally, they have. And there was this study by the Rand Corporation in 2015, and Allison talks about it in his book. It found that China had already caught up to the U.S., or was really close to catching up, in 6 out of 9 key areas of conventional military capability.
6 out of 9, what were those areas?
I'm glad you asked. Things like shipbuilding, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, air defense systems, that kind of thing.
Whoa, okay. That's kind of freaky.
Yeah, and on top of that, the Rand study concluded that the U.S. military advantage in Asia, it's shrinking. Now, this doesn't mean that China's about to overtake the U.S. militarily, but it does suggest that the gap is closing fast.
Right, and any shift in that power balance has huge implications,
Yeah.
obviously, for stability in the region and for U.S. interests there. It's not hard to see why this is making people nervous.
Absolutely. It's like when you see two ships in the fog
Yeah.
and they're heading towards each other. You know, they might crash, but you just don't know if they'll be able to change course in time.
Yeah, and to make matters even more complicated, it's not just about the economics and the military. There's also this huge cultural and ideological difference between the two countries that we have to consider. You know, it's weird. We talk about the U.S. and China like they're these giant things,
Right.
these big players on the world stage, but we forget sometimes that there are actual people involved, people with their own history and values and totally different ways of seeing things.
It's so true. And it's easy to overlook. We get caught up in the numbers, the economics, the military stuff, that we kind of forget about the huge cultural differences that
Yeah.
really shape how these two countries approach, well, everything.
Exactly. And this is where I really got into Destined for War. Allison talks about this idea of a clash of civilizations, which was this term this political scientist Samuel Huntington came up with.
Oh, yeah, Huntington. Right. He was saying that in the 21st century, the big conflicts, they wouldn't be between countries so much, but between cultures, ones that have totally different values at their core. And he thought the U.S. and China were like the perfect example of this clash.
Right. Because, like it or not, the U.S. and China have very different values.
For sure. And Huntington had these 5 main characteristics of Confucian civilization
Yeah.
that have been super important in Chinese culture for centuries, like a really strong emphasis on hierarchy, social harmony, putting the group before the individual.
Yeah. Things that, let's be real, don't always line up with the whole American ideal of individual freedom and democracy.
Yeah, exactly. And these aren't just like abstract differences either. They have real consequences for how these countries deal with each other, international relations, even their own domestic policies.
It's like that part in Allison's book where he quotes Hillary Clinton. She said something like, "I don't want my grandchildren to live in a world dominated by the Chinese."
Oh, yeah, I remember that line. And, you know, a lot of Americans probably feel that way, even if they wouldn't say it quite like that. It speaks to this fear of what would the world even look like if China was calling the shots?
And it's not even just about global domination, right? It's about just the way they do things. The U.S. and China. How they govern themselves, how they solve problems. Their whole view on the role of government is different.
Totally. So the U.S. system, with its checks and balances and all that, it's meant to be slow. It's meant to prevent any one person or group from having too much power, which is good, but it also means that it can be, well, really freaking slow, especially when you're dealing with these huge long-term problems like climate change or global pandemics.
And then you've got China, where things are much more centralized. And yeah, it's got its own issues, but they can make decisions way faster and implement stuff on a massive scale.
Right. And that gives them a real edge when it comes to economic planning, building infrastructure, responding to crises, things like that.
So basically, we've got this whole cocktail of economic, military, and cultural factors all shaping the U.S.-China relationship. And it's messy, and it's always changing, and it can be kind of overwhelming. So where do we go from here? How do we make this work without falling into this Thucydides trap that Allison's talking about?
That is the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. And in his book, Allison doesn't act like he's got it all figured out, but he does give us some possible paths we could take.
Okay, so lay it on us. What are our options? War, surrender, or something else?
Luckily, there are more than just those 2 choices. So Allison talks about 2 main strategies, adapting and redefining the relationship. So adapting basically means we accept that the balance of power is shifting, and we adjust our expectations and our policies accordingly.
So less about clinging to the way things used to be and more about figuring out how to make it work in a world where China has a much bigger role.
Exactly. It's about being realistic about China's influence and finding ways to work together on the things that affect us all, climate change, global health, the economy.
Okay, and what about the other option, redefining the relationship? What does that look like?
So that's about trying to build a whole new framework for the relationship, one that's based on respect, understanding, and being upfront with each other.
So it's like we hit the reset button, try to start fresh.
Pretty much, yeah. It means letting go of old rivalries, Cold War thinking, all that, and trying to create a future where both countries can do well without going to war with each other.
Easier said than done, I'm sure. But yeah, something we should definitely be working towards. This whole conversation makes me think about that Bismarck quote, the one Allison uses in the book. Being a statesman is like listening for God's footsteps in history and trying to catch the hem of his garment as he passes.
Oh, I love that quote.
Yeah,
It's so true. It's about being humble, paying attention, and being ready to change with the times.
for sure. And for anyone listening who wants to understand what's going to shape the world in the 21st century, pay attention to the U.S.-China relationship. It's full of challenges, no doubt, but there's also a lot of opportunity there.
Couldn't agree more. And as you learn more about all this, think about this. Allison focuses on these historical parallels. But there are all these new factors in play today. Technology, climate change, globalization. Could those things make things worse? Or could they actually create new opportunities for cooperation? Something to think about.
Great point. And on that note, we'll leave you all to ponder the possibilities. This has been a really fascinating deep dive. I think we all learned a lot today. Thanks for joining us.